Welcome back to Verbal Sparring, and welcome to the State of the UFC of 2025. I started this series last year, but it kind of fell off near the end, and I wanted to rework it, revamp it a little bit as we head into the new year for 2025, and that is what we have done today. So, each month, January all the way through December, we will break down all of the events by the numbers that happened for the UFC. For this episode, we have the two events that kicked off the year in January, UFC Vegas 101 and UFC 311. Let's start with the first event of the year. It was headlined with a rematch 5 years in the making in the strawweight division between Mackenzie Dern and Amanda Ribas at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, Nevada, UFC Vegas 101. This card had 14 fights in total with 7 knockouts, 2 submissions, and 5 decisions. There were 4 first-round knockouts, just 1 in the second, and 2 in the third. As for the submissions, we saw 1 in the first round and 1 in the third round, and of the 5 decisions, 4 of them were unanimous and 1 was a split. We saw 1 fight apiece in the light heavyweight, featherweight, men's flyweight, and women's flyweight divisions, 3 fights at both middleweight and welterweight, 2 fights at both lightweight and strawweight, and the only ranked matchup on the card was in that main event slot, as we saw the number 6 ranked Mackenzie Dern taking on the number 8 ranked strawweight Amanda Ribas, where we would see Dern get revenge from her 2019 loss to Ribas, and she did it with a third round submission with just 4 seconds remaining in that round via armbar. However, being that Dern was already ranked above Ribas, there were no changes to the rankings in the strawweight division, and throughout the remainder of the card, there were no other divisions affected by the results. Now let's jump into the first pay-per-view event of 2025, UFC 311, headlined by Islam Makhachev versus Renato Moicano in Inglewood, California, the Intuit Dome, the brand new state-of-the-art arena. This card featured 13 fights with 3 knockouts and 3 submissions apiece and 7 decisions. As for the knockouts, there were 2 in the first round and 1 in the third round. And for submissions, there were also 2 in the first round, but this time 1 in the second round. And out of all 7 fights that went to the judges' scorecards, every single judge agreed, and there were 7 unanimous decisions. We saw 1 fight in the heavyweight, flyweight, and women's bantamweight divisions, 2 fights each at light heavyweight, middleweight, and lightweight, and bantamweight taking home the crown at UFC 311 with 4 fights in total on the 13-fight card. And as expected with the UFC pay-per-view event, there were a lot of changes to the rankings. We start in the men's bantamweight division where Merab Dvalishvili successfully defended his championship for the first time and gave Umar Nurmagomedov, the number 2 ranked bantamweight in the world, the first loss of his professional career over the course of a 25-minute decision, an all-timer for the 135-pound division's history. We would see the number 2 ranked Umar Nurmagomedov drop to number 3 and the number 3 ranked Petr Yan, former opponent of Merab Dvalishvili, rise up to number 2. Grant Dawson extended his win streak to 3 by getting a dominant decision victory over the longtime veteran Diego Ferreira, and as a result, he launched himself back into the lightweight rankings, capping it out at number 15. We saw Benoit Saint Denis drop from number 12 to 14, and we saw Jalen Turner and Paddy Pimblett both rise up 1 spot to number 13 and number 12 respectively. In the featured bout of the night, we would see 2 former champions square off as Yuri Prohaska, number 2, would take on Jamal Hill, the number 3 ranked light heavyweight in the world. These two went to war, and if it wasn't for the high-level MMA bout in the co-main event between Merab and Umar, this would have taken home the cake for fight of the night. Some would even say, including myself, that it was still the fight of the night. We would see Yuri Prohaska weather the storm and finish Jamal Hill 3 minutes and 1 second into the third and final round. Jamal would drop from number 3 to number 4 as a result, and the former champion Jan Blachowicz would re-enter the top 3. And conveniently for him, he fights in March against the surging Carlos Alberg. And lastly, in the women's bantamweight division, we saw a ranked fight happen, and we saw a big-time change to the division leading into the fights on Saturday. In terms of the action at UFC 311, we saw Eileen Perez extend her win streak to 5. She would do so by defeating Karol Rosa via unanimous decision, and heading into this fight, Eileen was number 13, and in the aftermath, she only rises 2 spots to number 11. But there may be more reasoning behind that than just the result of the fight. And that is because we would see the number 8 ranked and former champion, multi-time title challenger Holly Holm be granted her release from the UFC, so that means her ranking was up for grabs and there was a whole big shuffle in the remainder of the division. So even though Karol Rosa lost to someone ranked 4 spots behind her, she actually just moved up 1 spot and took the number 8 ranking from Holly Holm. Then we would see Yana Santos, Misha Tate, Jacqueline Cavalcanti, and Chelsea Chandler all rise up one spot, and we had a newcomer to the rankings in Nora Carnol from unranked to number 15. So now let's combine both UFC 311 and UFC Vegas 101 and talk about the totals by the numbers. We saw 27 fights with 10 knockouts, 5 submissions, and 12 decisions. With 15 victories coming by way of stoppage out of 27 total, that brings our finish rate for the month to 55.6%. We saw 6 knockouts come in the first round, 1 in the second round, and 3 in the third round. And of the 5 submissions, we saw 3 in the first round and then 1 apiece in the second and third. And for the 12 decisions, 11 of them would come by way of unanimous, and only 1 would see the judges differ via split. The divisions with the least amount of activity through January 2025 for the UFC, well, there were 4 divisions that all saw 1 fight apiece, and it was heavyweight, featherweight, women's bantamweight, and women's flyweight. The division with the most amount of action for the first month of the year was actually the middleweight division with 5 total fights, and there's a lot more coming at 185 pounds come February. We would see 4 fights in lightweight and bantamweight, 3 fights at light heavyweight and welterweight, and 2 fights at flyweight and women's strawweight. We talked about changes to the UFC rankings following each event, or lack thereof if you go to UFC Vegas 101, but now let's talk about the pound-for-pound rankings and where they stand heading into February. Following UFC 311 and Merab's 12th consecutive victory and first successful title defense over Umar Nurmagomedov, we would see him move up from number 7 to number 5 amongst the men's pound for pound. And due to him rising 2 spots, that means we had to see 2 people fall, and it was the number 5 ranked Bilal Muhammad moving to number 6, and the number 6 ranked Dricus du Plessis moving to number 7, who is scheduled to defend his title for the second time against Sean Strickland at UFC 312. For the rest of the men's pound for pound rankings, let's talk about who's sitting at the top and who's rounding it out at number 15. Well, you guessed who's at number 1, and that is Islam Makhachev, who also competed at UFC 311, and while there weren't any changes to his placement in the lightweight division, and there weren't any changes to his placement in the men's pound-for-pound rankings, there was a change to his placement in the eyes and heart of Dana White, who said,
he's already the pound-for-pound number 1 ranked.
But is he yours?
Yeah. I'll give it to him.
Fair enough.
Are you happy? Is everybody happy now?
Yeah.
And rounding out the men's pound-for-pound rankings at number 15 is the former lightweight champion, Charles do Bronx Oliveira. And for the women's pound-for-pound rankings, well, there were no changes whatsoever. So as it currently sits, the number 1 pound-for-pound women's fighter on the planet right now is Valentina Shevchenko, the women's flyweight champion. And rounding out the women's pound-for-pound rankings at number 15 is Macy Barber, who is on a 6-fight win streak and looking to bounce back in 2025 after a nasty illness/injury sidelined her for a lot of 2024. And now let's talk about UFC debutantes, UFC newcomers who got a victory in their very first fight under the promotion's banner. At UFC Vegas 101, we would see 3 UFC newcomers all be successful in their first bout. In the light heavyweight division, we saw Bruno Lopez get a unanimous decision victory over Magomed Godzi Yasulov. In the welterweight division, we saw the undefeated Jacoby Smith improve his perfect record, and he got it via first-round knockout over UFC veteran Preston Parsons. And in the middleweight division, we would see Marco Tulio knock out Ihor Potieria in the first round 3 minutes and 4 seconds in. And at UFC 311, we would see 1 UFC newcomer get a victory in their first fight, and that was Azamat Bikoev, who coming into this took the fight on short notice and was the reigning LFA champion. He knocked out Dana White Contender Series alum Zachary Reese in the very first round with nasty ground and pound strikes 3 minutes and 4 seconds in. And last but not least, let's talk about what's next up in the month of February for the UFC. The next The State of will be covering UFC Saudi Arabia coming up Saturday, February 1st in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, headlined by the number 2 ranked former champion Israel Adesanya and the number 5 ranked middleweight Nassourdine Imavov. Following that, we will see UFC 312 go down in Sydney, Australia with 2 championship bouts. The main event will be Dricus du Plessis taking on Sean Strickland in a rematch, and in the co-main event, we will see the women's strawweight champion Zhang Weili look to defend once more, this time against the undefeated phenom that is Tatiana Tatiana Suarez. Following the February pay-per-view, we will head back to the UFC Apex, where the number 8 ranked former title challenger Jared Cannonier will be welcoming Gregory Rodriguez in for his chance to enter the middleweight rankings. And the final event of February goes down in Seattle, Washington. The UFC's return there for the first time in over a decade will be headlined by ranked bantamweights. The number 7 ranked former 2-weight champion and Olympic gold medalist Henry Cejudo will be taking on the number 8 ranked Song Yadong. If you enjoyed this recap of the month of January 2025 for the UFC, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, where every month you can expect to see this type of content following the end of the calendar for the UFC, and every single week I break down and preview the biggest fights, the best storylines, and what is at stake. I also recap the most meaningful results from each card and give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. Be sure to join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platform, where every Monday and Friday podcast episodes release on Spotify, Apple, and much more. Have a great week, and I will see you in the next video.